Hello, my name is Ian Raby, and I will be discussing some of the main leadership takeaways in Michael Lewis's The Undoing Project. The Undoing Project is, at its core, a book about decision making and how humans are often unable to make logical decisions because we're all, well, human, and we often cannot see that our decision making is plagued by different biases. It's also a book about the friendship and rich collaboration between two Israeli psychologists, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who effectively wrote the book on the psychological aspects of decision making. The culmination of Kahneman and Tversky's collaboration was their development of prospect theory, which became a key element of behavioral economics, which is used by economists to determine why people make certain economic decisions by weighing factors like risk tolerance and loss aversion, and how human economic decision making can often completely ignore logic and statistics. The biggest takeaway from this book, from a leadership standpoint, is that it helps you to understand what these different biases are so that you can better identify them in your own decision making. The first bias the book examines is confirmation bias. Now, the concept of confirmation bias was not developed by Kahneman and Tversky, but it does a great job illustrating how these cognitive biases can cloud our judgment without us even realizing that it's happening. Speaking to Daryl Morey, the general manager of the NBA's Houston Rockets, Morey reveals how difficult it was to get his scouts to separate the impressions they gleaned after seeing a prospective player in action and the statistical data they had on that player. Morey developed a model to assess basketball players akin to what Billy Beane had done with the Oakland A's baseball team, which was the basis for the book Moneyball, also written by Michael Lewis. Morey had developed sophisticated algorithms to determine which players the team should draft based on their statistics and physical attributes, but found, quote, whatever prejudice a person brought to the business of selecting amateur players, he tended to preserve, even when it served him badly, because he was always looking to have that prejudice confirmed. This confirmation bias is something that affects all types of people and all types of leaders. If one is basing their decisions on this selective data, the decisions are not going to be based on logic, but on the desire to have their own opinions and beliefs corroborated. This is something that is a big problem now with fake news, where people are taking things they see on the media or on Facebook at face value and using that to base their opinions and judgments, even though these stories are flatly untrue or at least distorted versions of the truth. In a library, this is why we are such big advocates for media literacy, so that we can try to help people make decisions based on multiple reputable sources rather than the ones that are most strictly aligned with a person's own worldview. Kahneman and Tversky are obsessed with these types of biases, the way we psychologically cannot separate our personal feelings and long-held beliefs from our decision-making. Another cognitive bias Lewis looks at is the halo effect. The halo effect, developed by Edward Thorndike in 1915, essentially states that if we find a person to have one particularly strong trait, we will give higher regard to that person's other less tangible qualities, even though there are no basis for doing so. One of Kahneman's first forays into dealing with cognitive biases was realizing that Israeli army interviewers were committing this cognitive bias when assessing new recruits. For instance, as in Thorndike's case, and the case with the Israeli army interviewers, a soldier with superior physical strength was also judged to have more impressive leadership qualities. These innate biases that we hold, that we often do not even notice we are falling victim to, are again at the core of Kahneman and Tversky's work. They argue that if we can identify these biases, we can avoid them. As a result of witnessing the halo effect in action, Kahneman developed a personality test that solved the problem for the Israeli military. By psychologically surveying the new recruits, Kahneman was able to devise a test to determine which recruits would make the best pilots, paratroopers, leaders, etc. Kahneman's test for new recruits is something that is still used today, and is one of the reasons Israel has one of the world's best military forces, despite the nation's small size. In a library, the halo effect could cause a library director to misjudge the performance of their staff. For instance, if one of the branch managers is always well-spoken and makes it sound like everything is totally fine, the director might assume that manager's superior confidence means they excel at all aspects of the job. What the director doesn't see is that the manager frequently hides in his office and ignores issues from staff because he knows as long as the branch keeps operating at its current level, there is little reason to work harder. Hence, it is important to keep an objective mindset when assessing employees so as not to have one's judgment clouded. Lewis describes a study conducted by Kahneman and Tversky that examined how human judgment was distorted by memory. They found that the information we had available to us based on our own experiences, whether those be lasting impressions from the past or recent experiences, affected human judgment. Here's a passage that really stuck out. This is quoting Kahneman and Tversky. In assessing the profit of a given company, people tend to assume normal operating conditions and make their estimates contingent upon that assumption. They do not incorporate into their estimates the possibility that these conditions may be drastically changed because of war, sabotage, or a major competitor being forced out of business. Lewis writes, "Here, clearly, was another source of error. Not just that people don't know what they don't know, but that they don't bother to factor their ignorance into their judgments." This passage made me think about weeding in a library. Weeding can be a very touchy subject, and it is important for a library leader to understand its necessity for a functioning library. Society has a tendency to treat books as these sacred objects, but they neglect to realize that these books are often printed on the scale of hundreds of thousands. Hence, when books are discarded or recycled, people will occasionally get up in arms. I saw this happen firsthand when my library's Friends of the Library group went to the local newspaper and complained about how many books we were getting rid of. It's great that people are so emotional about books, but in this case, the public only got half the story. Though the library's website provides a detailed explanation of our weeding protocols, the library director instituted a months-long ban on weeding. It hampered our ability to effectively remove non-circulating, outdated, or damaged books from our collection, and ultimately undermined our ability to best serve the public. There is this assumption that libraries are these shrines for these aforementioned sacred objects, but that is a distorted view of how the library actually functions and the role it serves in the community. Even though the information about the library's weeding practices is readily available, it's hard to override the public's traditional understanding of how a library operates. These biases are present in all of us, and it is a lot of work to take a step back and realize what we are doing. Tversky and Kahneman talk about recency bias, which is when we take a piece of recent information and use that to predict future events, wholly ignoring historical data and statistics. A lot of their work in this book is viewed through an economist lens, but these biases can affect anyone in any given field. Kahneman and Tversky state, quote, "There is much evidence showing that once an uncertain situation has been perceived or interpreted in a particular fashion, it is quite difficult to view it any other way. We often decide that an outcome is extremely unlikely or impossible because we are unable to imagine any chain of events that could cause it to occur. The defect often is our imagination." End quote. Essentially, our brains are flawed and basically want to trick us. Often it's easier to rely on a gut feeling than to believe objective data. Looking at this through the lens of a library hiring manager, maintaining objectivity is the key to breaking away from these biases, specifically in hiring. If a prospective manager, a hiring manager is looking to hire, gives a great charismatic interview, but the resume is full of red flags, the hiring manager might favor that immediate personal experience over other data at hand. In this scenario, it is important to take all data into account in an effort to form a well-rounded and logical opinion on this candidate. The crux of what Kahneman and Tversky's work is all about is best summed up by Don Rettelmeyer, a physician who later collaborated with Amos Tversky. Quote, "They provided a language and a logic for articulating some of the pitfalls people encounter when they think. Now these mistakes could be communicated. It was the recognition of human error, not its denial, not its demonization, just the understanding that they are part of human nature." What I like about this quote is that it treats our susceptibility to bias as a natural occurrence. It's something that affects all of us, and by destigmatizing our susceptibility, it helps us to accept the fact that our brains are looking for the path of least resistance. Kahneman and Tversky's work isn't trying to shame people for committing these cognitive biases, but trying to raise awareness for their existence. A paper penned by Rettelmeyer and Tversky involved debunking the commonly held belief that arthritis worsened with extreme weather. They deduced that selective matching led people to look for changes in the weather when they experienced arthritic pain and ignore it when the weather was normal. This way of thinking could be applied to a library setting. When we are looking for solutions to our problems, it is easy to retrofit the environment to the problem, rather than isolating the true cause. It's important to be mindful of one's working environment at all times, rather than tuning out and only paying attention when something is going wrong. If you are, say, only addressing problems when they reach their breaking point, you're missing opportunities to circumvent these problems, and thus preventing them from deterring productivity. Kahneman and Tversky's work is all about establishing that intuition, gut feelings, and conventional wisdom are all totally flawed in the realm of decision-making. Per Lewis and Tversky, quote, "The failure of decision-makers to grapple with the inner workings of their own minds and their desire to indulge their gut feelings made it, quote, quite likely that the fate of entire societies may be sealed by a series of avoidable mistakes committed by their leaders." End quote. For Kahneman, quote, "No one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. The understanding of numbers is so weak that they don't communicate anything. Everyone feels that these probabilities are not real, that they are just something on somebody's mind. One of the most enlightening parts of the book was the section that discussed Kahneman and Tversky's work on how people naturally seek to minimize regret rather than maximizing utility. Kahneman noted that it was, quote, the anticipation of regret that affects decisions, along with the anticipation of other consequences. This is in the vein of the modern phenomenon of fear of missing out. It's a deeply personal thing, but it's something that could easily be carried into the workplace. For instance, a collection development librarian might keep buying expensive volumes that they personally believe belong in the collection, but the statistics indicate that they never circulate. This is obviously not the best use of the library's funds, and while it is important to allow a collection development librarian a sense of agency, it becomes problematic when one's personal feelings are utilizing public funds on items the public does not want, rather than consulting circulation statistics and finding more items that would be of more use to the community. When developing prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky would propose different gambles to test subjects. For instance, to quote Lewis, when you gave a person a choice between a gift of $500 and a 50-50 shot of winning $1,000, he picked the sure thing. Give the same person a choice between losing $500 for sure and a 50-50 risk of losing $1,000, and he took the bet. People consistently took the sure thing when the query involved a surefire gain, and took the gamble when the query involved a surefire loss. Kahneman and Tversky's examination of this phenomena involved a concept they called framing. This brought to mind Bolman and Deal's work on framing from earlier in the semester, and their discussion of mental models is a great way to combat the biases Kahneman and Tversky expose in their work. What Kahneman and Tversky did was present test subjects with two sets of data that essentially stated the exact same thing, but had the wording reversed. For instance, here are two versions of the same scenario. The first version states, a disease is going to kill 600 people. There are two alternatives. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved. Subjects overwhelmingly went with program A. The second version poses the same dilemma with the disease, but if program A is adopted, 400 people will die, and if program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die. In this case, subjects overwhelmingly went with program B. When framed as a gain in the first version, the subjects went with the sure thing. When framed as a loss in the second version, they took the risk. Per Lewis, people did not choose between things. They chose between descriptions of things. This information was big for economists, but I feel like this study is very useful for understanding how important communication is to leadership. The way a leader frames instructions to employees is essential for achieving results. By framing instructions in a positive light, like do this and, rather than a negative light, like do this or else, the leader presents tasks in a way that shows what they have to gain opposed to what they stand to lose if they do not cooperate. When asked by Delta Airlines about what they should do to prevent mental mistakes on behalf of their pilots, who were having trouble landing at the right airports, Tversky suggested that they would not be able to train decision-making weaknesses out of the pilots, but that they would need to change the decision-making environment. The cockpit culture at Delta was one where the pilot was essentially an autocratic ruler, and this prevented the co-pilot and others in the cockpit from speaking up, even when they could see the problem and the pilot could not. This led Delta to change their cockpit culture, which eliminated the mistakes. I thought this was interesting because in this scenario, Tversky was able to address the problem at its root, i.e. the toxic cockpit culture, which he understood would be more effective than trying to fix each pilot individually. This idea of changing the way things are done on a system level could be very useful for a library that is struggling with personnel issues or a library that is dealing with draconian policies and procedures in need of updating. Overall, I thought this book was very enlightening in the way it examined the psychological flaws that are biologically hardwired into our brains. Understanding the biases discussed in the book are essential for logical decision-making in any sort of leadership role. I also thought the book was incredibly engaging. The first line of the description on the back cover of the book reads, 40 years ago, Israeli psychologists Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky wrote a series of breathtakingly original papers that invented the field of behavioral economics, which doesn't necessarily scream scintillating reading, but this is sort of what Michael Lewis does with his books, takes a subject matter that's maybe not the most interesting on paper and then makes it super interesting and engaging. This book really felt like a narrative about the friendship between these two psychologists, and by the end, when they drifted apart after years of inseparability and extremely fertile collaboration, it's really emotional and moving. That's all just to say that this is a really good book, and it's full of great stuff to file away in your brain that you can consult when you're out in the field making leadership decisions.